I now give the floor to His Excellency Bruno Eduardo Rodríguez Parrilla, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Cuba, to introduce draft resolution A/80/L6.
Señora Presidenta.
Madam President, I express profound condolences and solidarity to the governments and people of Jamaica, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, who have suffered loss of life following the passage of Hurricane Melissa. Also to Panama, that has also suffered some damage due to intense rain. Also our best wishes to the Bahamas and Bermuda. I speak on behalf of a people who right now, with scarce resources and practically only by sheer will, unity and solidarity, are coping with a monstrous hurricane. As we heard yesterday from the leader of the Cuban Revolution, Raul Castro Ruiz, and I quote, "In light of this new challenge, we will also rise victorious." We have heard the infamous, threatening, arrogant, deceitful, and cynical statement made by the new permanent representative of the United States, who is not here in the room. That it came as no surprise, knowing as we do where this character comes from, as well as his shady links with the Secretary of State and the mafia of military contractors, as well as the political mafia of Miami. Yesterday, from this rostrum, he said that he was going to refer to facts, but he did quite the opposite. I will just recall what he seems to ignore despite his responsibilities, or even worse, what he perhaps even distorts with a mendacious spirit. The laws and rules of his country's economic aggression against Cuba are not ambiguous in terms of their actions and ambitions. They openly declare in law their goal, which is to restrict Cuba's commercial, investment and credit relations with all countries. They also establish in law the obligation on US diplomats to comply with that mandate during their contacts with officials from other governments, the governments that you represent. I would recommend reading from my colleagues from the US Title I and Title III of the Helms-Burton Act, as well as the content of the Torricelli Act. Action speaks louder than words, and I will refer to such action in crystal clear terms. This assembly will decide for itself, as it has done now for 33 years, whether this item is an economic blockade or not. Over the last few weeks, there has been a brutal and unprecedented deployment of pressure, intimidation, and toxicity by the State Department at the planetary level to force sovereign states to change their vote on the resolution that we will adopt today. They have resorted to all of their weapons and tricks, especially coercion. But the truth, law, reason, and justice are always far more powerful and overwhelming. It's not possible to hide the fact that by virtue of the United States government's criminal policy against Cuba, my country is viciously deprived in every corner of the world of the use of banking systems to make payments and collect funds. Cuba is deprived of access to sources of financing, investment capital, remittances, technology for its industry, food production, infrastructure, scientific development, and services, including the most sensitive ones, such as healthcare. The strategic aim of the blockade is to provoke a social breakdown that would lead to the breakdown of constitutional order that Cubans have decided to freely form in various referenda. The Secretary of State is the malign, corrupt, and fraudulent reincarnation of Mr. Mallory, and the permanent representative has come to speak on his behalf. As you know, the impact of this type of aggression is not only economic, it applies by design with cold premeditation in terms of its social and humanitarian impact on millions of people. In Cuba, for instance, recent years, and I say so with pain, the deterioration of some health indicators, which, although they are still outstanding for a developing country and comparable to those of industrialized countries, are today lower than the indices that our country was able to progressively achieve. One example of this is infant mortality, which, after consecutive years with rates below 5 per 1,000 live births, now stands at 8.5 in the first half of this year. One would have to lie, as indeed was done by the permanent representative of the United States, to ignore the link between this result and the impact of the economic blockade on the sustainability of our health system. Just as it would be impossible to ignore the impact of the economic blockade on life expectancy or maternal mortality rates or the availability of highly subsidized medicines for the population. Between March 1st, 2024 and February 28th, 2025 alone, the blockade caused Cuba some $7.5 billion in material damage. This is an impact similar to the nominal gross domestic product of at least 30 countries that are represented here, according to World Bank data. But the damage of the blockade cannot only be seen in figures and material damage, rather we see it on the daily lives of our citizens. No one, no family or sector escapes its daily devastating effects. Dialianis, a young Cuban lady, 29 years of age, suffering from hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which is a potentially life-threatening condition, requires the implant of an automatic defibrillator that Cuba does not have access to. Dialianis and many other Cuban patients with similar illnesses are still waiting for this type of implant. 6-year-old Abdiel needs a hip operation that requires a bone graft. This sort of tissue is produced at the tissue bank in the Frank Pais hospital, but the essential freeze-drying process has been halted due to the lack of a sensor. It has not been possible to purchase it, even with the money to pay for it, because the companies that supply it, in light of the blockade against Cuba, refused to sell it in accordance with usual commercial practices. This is not collateral damage. These are not isolated cases. These are everyday experiences. These are human beings, innocent human beings who are suffering. The creativity of our institutions and the professionals who work within them is extraordinary and highly commendable. But it is impossible to calculate the anguish that this situation wreaks on Cuban families, or the strain of not being able to access these medicines and supplies when they're needed. An essential component of the worsening blockade since 2019 has been increased persecution on fuel supply operations, including shipping companies, insurance companies, banks, and governments. This has led in Cuba to a reduction in suppliers and an exponential rise in prices. Electric cuts or blackouts are today one of the most visible and irritating impacts of the economic blockade against Cuba, having a daily effect on families, which is at times exasperating. It has an impact on other sectors such as water supply, production processes, services, and the economy as a whole, all of which weighs on the population. Just a few months ago, one corporation from a country and the friendly government of that country stated that it was impossible for them to supply one spare part and mere technical assistance to repair a large thermo power station in Cuba due to the threat of sanctions by the US. Another vital sector of the economy that has been particularly damaged is tourism. Today, citizens from more than 40 countries are being intimidated and threatened with reprisals by the US government if they decide to visit Cuba, as well as prohibition on accessing the e-visa ESTA system, without being, even though they might decide freely to exercise their right to visit Cuba. The US government not only deprives its citizens of the right to travel to Cuba, but it also seeks and manages to deprive, through coercion, citizens from other countries that are not under its jurisdiction of those rights, especially from Europe. One of the measures that has the greatest impact is the unjustifiable presence of Cuba in the unilateral and arbitrary list published by the United States government of states allegedly sponsoring terrorism. Cuba is a victim of terrorism. So we have previously demonstrated before this assembly. For years and even today, terrorist acts against the country have been and are still being organized and financed from US territory. These terrorists live here peacefully and with absolute impunity. These are the notorious perpetrators of horrific acts of aggression against Cuban people, resulting in thousands of dead, maimed, and extensive material damage. In 2023, we handed over to the US government the names and information on 62 terrorists and 20 terrorist organizations acting against Cuba from this country, and so far, the US government has done nothing about it. The economic warfare includes a comprehensive program of destabilization. And I will condemn this action for the first time here. This includes a comprehensive program of destabilization, financed, organized, and executed directly by the United States government through the use of operatives of Cuban origin based in this and other countries. Their mission and their assignment is to lower the incomes of the Cuban population through speculative manipulation of the exchange rate. This has a direct impact on price increases, spreading intimidating and alarming messages on social media, as well as a consequent change to the market's natural operation. The effect of this is severe harm to the pockets of every Cuban and additional obstacles to macroeconomic stabilization programs. To do this, they resort to the laundering of money from the US federal budget, using funds assigned by the US Congress and used by the State Department, several non-governmental organizations and contractors that channel such funds. Our government has irrefutable evidence of these operations. This includes data, names, contacts, communications, and the direct involvement of the US government and its diplomats. This is a criminal activity that is contrary to international law, Cuban laws, and even United States laws. The United States has tried to sell the idea that the blockade is a justification used by the Cuban government to hide its inefficiencies or the errors of its development model. This political campaign is based on a propaganda and digital campaign which uses toxic disinformation, euphemisms, selective silence, and the coordinated saturation of messages, seeking to establish the perception that the blockade does not exist or does not affect the population. The United States government not only attempts to deny or minimize the blockade, but also penalizes those who document its harm and consequences by resorting to smear campaigns, cyber troops paid with the funds earmarked for a regime change, and the algorithmic censorship of Cuban national content. Anyone denying the Cuban problems on Cuba would be lying and is lying. Indeed, the proponents of this blockade publicly undermine its effects and its ability to affect the living conditions of an entire people. Please look back at the statements of the United States Secretary of State and politicians who have made their careers and built their wealth with aggression on Cuba. If the United States government has any slight concern in trying to help the Cuban people, as they say they do, they should either suspend or make humanitarian exceptions to the blockade as a result of the harm that it is causing and that is being caused by Hurricane Melissa. Cuba is a peace-loving country. No one in their right mind with a modicum of honesty can claim that Cuba represents or intends to represent a threat to the national security of the United States, and which is a great power, nor to the well-being of the American people. Which country has military forces deployed in an aggressive, extraordinary, and unjustified manner in the Caribbean Sea as we hold our discussions here? Which country threatens regional peace, security, and stability, particularly the peace and right to self-determination of the kindred Venezuelan people? Which country has adopted the criminal practice of ordering its armed forces to commit murders in the high seas or within the territorial or jurisdictional waters of other countries, as we see today in the Caribbean or in the Pacific? Which country has our region riddled with military bases and openly plots aggressive plans of subversion and regime change against progressive governments. Which government is the direct accomplice, the provider of weapons and financing for the genocide in Gaza? If the United States government wishes to contribute to peace in our America, it should withdraw the military threat and accept a civilized dialogue without preconditions or impositions with Venezuela, with Colombia, with Nicaragua, with Cuba, and with all countries with which it has differences, and collectively with the community of Latin American and Caribbean states. The blockade is a policy of collective punishment. It qualifies as an act of genocide. It flagrantly, massively, and systematically violates the human rights of Cubans. It makes no distinction between social sectors or economic actors. I'm very grateful to those who in this debate and in the high-level segment in this session spoke up to request the end of the blockade and the removal of our country from the spurious list of state sponsors of terrorism. I'd also like to thank the regional groups who over the years have made robust statements in this regard, to the numerous organizations and movements of solidarity, standing in solidarity with Cuba around the world, and Americans who call for a relationship based on respect and sovereign equality between both countries. I recognize the expressions of Cubans in the United States and around the world who, through their statements and supportive patriotic actions, are opposed to and fight against the blockade. Cuba will not surrender. We will persist in speaking up against the infamy. We will exercise our right decisively to decide on our own fate. We will continue in our efforts to overcome the current difficulties and to ensure the economic sustainability of the country, even with the continuation or even with the subsequent strengthening of the blockade. With Jose Marti, our people reaffirmed today that in order to before giving up on the effort to make our homeland prosperous and free, the South Sea will join the North Sea, and a serpent will hatch from an eagle's egg. And from Antonio Maceo, who tried to take over Cuba, I recall he said, "Whoever tries to take over Cuba will gather the dust of its blood-soaked soil if they do not perish in the struggle." And with Fidel Castro Ruiz, we shout once again, homeland or death, we shall overcome. Madam President, on behalf of the noble and fraternal people of Cuba, who for decades have been working on an admirable feat of patriotism, justice, resistance, creation, and sacrifice, I respectfully request all member states to vote in favor of draft resolution A/AT/L6 entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. Distinguished ambassadors, delegates, doing so would be an act of justice in favor of a peace-loving people that today is facing not only the blockade, but with the blockade, another monstrous hurricane. Thank you.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Cuba.